Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. Very, very happy to have joining us for the first time on this program, Cedric Johnson, Associate Professor of Black Studies and Political Science at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the author of many books, including the editor of Neoliberal Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, Late Capitalism, and the Remaking of New Orleans. Cedric, thanks so much for doing this.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So yeah, it's my pleasure. It feels like a long time coming. So let's just start broad. There are these protest uprisings that have taken place across the country, waves, not only in major cities, but actually in rural areas and towns as well, which I think is significant after the murder of George Floyd. And just, take us from 10,000 feet. What do you think of the effects, the politics of the protests, what's your kind of high-level read on it?
Yeah, I think maybe one way to think about it. I think we're looking at multiple things that are happening at once. Obviously, thinking about it in terms of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's death is one place to start, but I think it limits us as far as understanding all the underlying dynamics. I would actually say there may be three things that are converging in this moment, right? There's the rebirth of Black Lives Matter as a phenomenon, right? Or maybe the resurfacing of it. Because I would say that, and most people, even within Black Lives Matter organizations, could say that it wasn't since the 2016 summer that we saw comparable sized demonstrations with respect to Black Lives Matter. You could also argue that maybe Charlottesville, there was some forces involved in Charlottesville. But once Trump was elected, on this sort of wave of Blue Lives Matter, law and order type posturing, Black Lives Matter recedes in importance. And even some of the activists decided that they were going to focus more on other kinds of campaigns and not necessarily protest as such. And I think we see with George Floyd, the rebirth of it. The question for me, and I guess for everyone else, is why? Like, why is it that George Floyd's death, even though we know that pretty much every day, or as an average of maybe 2 to 3 people that are killed by police in the United States, and it's been like that for the last decade, why is it in this moment that one video would catalyze, so much in a way of discontent? And I think part of it is the pandemic, right? So we've been, pent up for the shelter in place. I think there's a lot of pent up energy as a result of that. You also had, early on, the resurfacing of a Black Lives Matter type discourse with respect to the pandemic, right? The idea that this was a Black plague. I think Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and a few other people characterized it in that way. And around that, right, there's all sorts of chatter on social media and elsewhere about this being something, even conspiratorial type positions being taken about why this was affecting Black people, early on in places like Detroit, New Orleans, and Chicago. And I think that that's part of it, right? It kind of softens the ground for what we saw with George Floyd. And even before George Floyd's killing, there was Ahmaud Arbery. There was three police killings in one weekend, or deaths that were related to the police in Indianapolis, as well as Breonna Taylor's killing, in Louisville. So all of these things are building, right? Just like there were precursors or antecedents to the Rodney King incident and the LA rebellion, I think we saw something similar here. The other thing, though, in thinking about the pandemic, and this is where I think, it might be helpful for us to draw a distinction between the George Floyd protests that were orchestrated by activists and the kind of rioting and looting we saw, which may be a slightly different phenomenon, converging with George Floyd's protests. But we could argue, and I said this to somebody else, it could be seen as like the Donald Trump riots, right? Because a lot of it has to do with 4 million unemployed, food pantries and other support services that are stretched thin because of the amount of need that exists right now. And a lot of the anxiety that so many people have right now about the future, aggravation with the lack of federal relief, and some of the uncertainty about what lies ahead. So I think all of these things are happening at once. The other part of it, and this, so we've got the George Floyd protests, which are kind of a revival of Black Lives Matter. We've got the Donald Trump riot, which is very much almost like a bread riot, where people are looting, and looting. And I should say this: they're not just looting in the ways that we've seen in the past, right, where it's largely very much concentrated within ghettoized sort of inner city areas. But instead, what we saw was looting, at least here in Chicago is one good example, everywhere, right? Like it sort of stretches out across the city. People are looting drugstores. There's images of folks running out of grocery stores with toilet paper and other like supplies. And into suburbs, suburban malls, strip malls, all these other things are being looted. So I think that the geography of it was much different than what we've seen in the past. And then you've also got a multiracial and intergenerational cast of people that are participating in, what would be considered, lawlessness or law-breaking behavior. But again, I think it has a clear economic origin, even if the motives of different people are all over the map. Some are opportunists, some are doing it out of need, some combinations of those. But so, yeah, I think the George Floyd protests, the Donald Trump riots, and then maybe the last ingredient would be the Democratic Party, right, which has been sort of on its heels since their attempt to impeach Donald Trump. And then after the challenge that was posed by Bernie Sanders, right? And then what better way, right, to sort of breathe new life into the corpse of the Biden campaign than to step forward with, this is like his moment, right? This is the thing he's familiar with. He's used to pandering to different constituencies, and this gives him the perfect moment to do that, right? To get up, to talk tough, to evoke Obama, and the glory days of the Obama White House. And so I think it helped not only his career, but then a number of other Democrats who also were trying to repair their reputations and, looking for their moment, right? So this was it. And I think that's why we saw such a rapid, move towards a justice and policing, bill. I mean, where the hell was this bill 2 years ago, 3 years ago, right? So it's sort of and I know people oftentimes, motivated by immediate events, but it reeks of an opportunism, at least from my vantage point, when we look at how the ways in which these same Democrats have been oriented towards public goods, really against it, right? Against Medicare for all, against free higher education, but now, able to deflect the social democratic demands in favor of racial justice, which is an easy win for them, right? It's an easy win, even if it's defeated. This is the beauty of it. Even if the bill is passed in the House and then defeated in the Senate, they can always cry a certain level of victory or claim victory, right? Because they can say, well, it was the racist Republicans, and it helps them electorally the next time around, right? So I just think it's unfortunate that we see that last converging element, but I think it's one that we have to watch, and I think we especially have to watch it at this point when so many people are enraptured, so many people are giddy about the protest in the streets, and assigning all sorts of potential to these developments that they may not deserve, right? Is probably the way I would characterize it.
So do you think that there's a lot of things to pick through, but just as far as the demands and the policies that are arising out of this, it seems like you've got, a bill that, where was this a week ago or 2 weeks ago or a month ago? But all things that make sense as a kind of basic, legal equity, civil rights package, including things that are just, I just can't get over. And not that it made, chokeholds were not allowed supposedly in New York when Eric Garner was choked to death. But regardless, like just the fact that we don't have a federal ban on chokeholds, that police are allowed to do that is mind blowing, right? and beefing up protections against racial profiling and all. So these things are all if I was in Congress, I'd vote for them.
Right.
Seems obvious, seems long past due. And then it obviously does not, graft onto, the joblessness, poverty, healthcare, or any of that. And then there's this defund demand, which is, it kind of runs the gamut. I mean, there is a little bit of like a kind of like libertarian, utopian sort of, and I think in some ways isn't terribly thought out, because one of the paradoxes that seems to come from, communities that are, I'll say, terrorized or abused by the police for, broken windows garbage. Right. They're also in other serious and substantive ways, maybe quote unquote under policed, as in we're not solving like actual crimes here. We'll harass you for drinking a beer all day, write a summons, beat you up, but then maybe, we're not going to take solving like an actual crime that nobody wants to be around seriously. And so, but at the same time, for all those criticisms, it seems, there is this very clear sense that no, a defund or a cut does not mean just a wave of austerity. It means that money's there and it needs to be reallocated. It can't just be you take $1 billion out of the NYPD and it, vanishes into thin air. That's $1 billion that has to go to healthcare, housing, jobs, and so on. So that points to something potentially, more structural. Is it a useful way of sort of delineating the differences in what's being put forward here? And do you see a hope for better outcomes in that route, or no?
So, I mean, I think, again, the geography is like critically important, right? So I was looking at coverage of protests in Jefferson Davis parish in Louisiana, right? And one of the things that they were demanding was police body cameras, right? In other places, they already have those, and they're not thinking that that's an important reform. But for people in Jeff Davis Parish, that seems like it's something they still want. So I think there's the diversity of approaches that are being taken, and a lot of it being dictated by the strength of real Black Lives Matter organizations and police reform organizations on the ground. The relative extent to which over-policing is a problem in that particular jurisdiction, what kinds of really the balance of forces, right, in these different locales, I think is going to determine what happens. And I think it's exciting. I mean, there's times when, as I see my responsibility as an intellectual is to bring in the criticism that other people aren't making, right, because of the giddiness and the excitement about what they see happening on the streets. I actually think there's openings here with respect to, a couple of things you said. Of course, at the federal level, if we get a situation where it makes it possible to prosecute, bad behavior by cops, right, that's an improvement over the situation that we have now. If we're able to create a context where citizens have more power to review and to determine what happens when there's a record or report of bad behavior, I think that's also an improvement. And I think maybe the most promising thing, not so much the defund slogan, but maybe the kinds of redistributive policies that's implied in it. What I would argue, and I said this in a few places, I think it's not enough, right? It's not enough to call for defunding the police as a way to argue for what amounts to a slightly revitalized welfare state, right? And on a low scale, largely at the municipal scale. I think that's inadequate. And I think we should be making a demand for things like public works, aside from what's happening with police departments, right? And if anything, I mean, if we're able to have universal public works, and that could even be done at a metropolitan scale as well, you're able to attack the very class conditions that police are there to manage, right? So if we're able to use state power to create employment for people and to organize that work around use values, around and decommodify goods and services that we all need, I think that's where some of those conversations are going, right? And that's at least what you hear, in the Fund Our Futures and other or Fund Black Futures um, type sentiments. But I just wonder, like you said, some of it tends to be a bit utopian. But I do think some of the demands about, reducing or shrinking the size of police departments and the kinds of things that police respond to make sense, right? I
Right.
mean,
Of course.
we shouldn't have, fully armed, flak jacketed police showing up because a kid on the autism spectrum is having an episode, right? And his parents are having a tough time handling. There's been multiple incidents here in Chicago and elsewhere where kids have died, right? When cops show up, and the cops actually have a knowledge of this person and the household and the problems that they've been dealing with, but the way in which it ends up is just not good, right? There's one clear case of that was the case of Stephon Watts, who was a kid who was late teenage. He was getting really big. He was hard for his parents to handle sometimes, and cops showed up. He's killed, right? And so I think situations like that do not need to be handled by police. And to be honest, and this is something you can't really say in these overheated moments, much of what police do on a day-to-day basis doesn't involve the active use of violence, right? I mean, people don't want to hear that. They always have the capacity and they have the legitimate use of state violence always at their disposal. That's where they derive their power from. But for the most part, I mean, we've always heard this kind of factoid: most police never discharge their service weapons in the course of a career. And most on a day-to-day basis are not involved in violence, right? That they're involved in routine things, showing up when there's a domestic violence dispute, making reports. I think the point you raised is a good one. In some communities, they don't do enough of that, right? They don't necessarily do their jobs at certain moments. And I think that was certainly revealed here when the riots broke out. I mean, there's all sorts of instances where we see police standing around, right, while stores in Black and brown neighborhoods are being looted, and while vigilantes are patrolling the streets and oftentimes, making racist attacks on people who they figure don't belong in their neighborhoods. So I think there's a lot of problems with police. If we can get a few solutions out of what's happening right now, that would be great. But I think ultimately, the form of policing we have is largely there to police working class and poor people, and really the most vulnerable and dispossessed elements of the working class. And we need to deal with that, right? I mean, that would actually be much better if we could get to it than trying to make all these various technocratic fixes with respect to police. The other thing I'll say with respect to that, I think if we don't develop some clarity in some cities and in places where left progressive and Black Lives Matter forces might be strongest, what we'll see instead, I think, will be a response with more like technocratic fixes, right? And some of these things are already in the works, right? In a lot of cities, you already see the use of fusion centers and intelligence-led policing, where they're aggregating data as a way, to try to solve crimes or to develop suspect lists. And so I think a lot of that's already happening. You also have, much more in the way of surveillance and network surveillance, where they're utilizing even people's personal, home security systems. If they have a camera, that information can be accessed by police departments. So I think, now we're moving into a space where there could be a solution which removes some of the most abusive and ugly parts of policing out of the way, right, where we can all live with it. But at the same time, not necessarily changing the conditions for people in ghettoized zones, deindustrialized towns, and other places where police presence is there to manage, criminalized forms of work and other activities. So I think we have to kind of keep dragging the conversation back to that reality.
Yeah, that brings up a couple of things that are really, I mean, one, I was talking. I'll mention again a conversation with Wozni Lambre on this show about the difference between, what he said, growing up with the boys in blue versus detectives. And he talked about the example of being 19 and going on his way to a party with some friends, and they're drinking, not the driver, but in the back seat, they're drinking beer, whatever. They've got some weed. And a plainclothes detective approaches the car and says, "Hey, listen, guys, basically, look, a couple of blocks from here, there was a shooting. We're checking people in this zone. We don't care. Your weed, your coke, your beer, this is not our problem. We've got an actual job to do. So if it's okay with you, we'd like to check the car." They checked the car. Of course, there's nothing there. And they said, "Go enjoy your summer." And he said it blew his mind. He's like, "Wait a second.
Right.
90% of my the boys in blue that's all they're there for, is, you're drinking a beer off your stoop. Here's a summons. You drink, here's a fine. Here's a false report. Wait a second. There's people out here who are actually doing something that has something to do with making sure my aunt doesn't get hurt." That's actually like a revelation in terms of policing. And I guess the other part of this that always comes up that is delicate, and it relates to what you alluded to before about some of the disparities discourse around Corona. And, and Adolph Reed, wrote a piece in 2016 on understanding the kind of broader demography of police violence. Now, when people on the right, when they give you stats where they say, first of all, hey, plenty of white people are shot by the police too, they're using that to deny racism. And actually more broadly, I wish we could get flipped on them more right, so that doesn't disturb, it doesn't disturb you that 1,000 unarmed people of every background are killed by law enforcement officials? Sounds to me like an opening of a pretty serious conversation, right? So we know the reason that it's deployed to justify the status quo, to stop conversations on racism, and to stop conversations on policing as a whole. However, and I want you to elaborate on this, why the direction of exclusively looking at it through a disparities lens takes us out of what you were saying in terms of what police's function has become. And I'll stop in a second, but it seems to me, and obviously police are not, they're not teachers, and I don't, but at the same time, there is an uneasy parallel there of, people who have a pretty specific public job all of a sudden getting blamed and held responsible for a multitude of the ills of capitalism, basically. Right. And not that it justifies any, certainly policing, but just that so much of the functionality of what cops are doing is in the context of us not providing a social infrastructure.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's tough to have these conversations about police, even before the protests erupted. Especially if you have a long and complicated relationship with police, right? So, I've been stopped by police a ton of times, right? And I could foreground that, right? I could start with how many pretext stops I've been in where it was clear they were just running license plates, right? It was clear they were just trying to find out if I was doing something wrong. I could also talk about, being slammed on the car, or tear gas, and other things that have happened to me. At the same time, I could also talk about being in neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods where, not only have I had guns drawn on me, but I've also had, been in within a few, meters from shooting incidents, right? And having to call the cops because somebody did a drive-by in a neighborhood where I used to live, and I was outside in the backyard with my son and one of his friends. Another time it was middle of the night, right? Somebody fired a sawed-off shotgun into a neighbor's house. So I think like having lived in situations where, you know, you get that feeling when the lights flash behind you, you got to pull over, you don't know what the hell's going to happen. I've had that experience, but I've also been on the other side where interactions with police have been useful, right? In a situation where there is real crime, right? And I know crime has been dropping in most cities, you know, for a few decades now, but there's certainly some parts of cities, and unfortunately it's the ones where many Black and brown working class folks live, or other people who live in those same zones who do experience crime, right? And so for me, it's a difficult thing. Like, how do we talk about them, and in a way which is does justice to the complicated nature of a workforce as large as the American, American police and corrections officers, so law enforcement in general. The one thing I would say, I mean, I actually think that there's much more contradiction in how police do their jobs. There's much more in the way of fragmentation and many different positions on what they're doing. That doesn't fly well with the hardcore abolition crowd, right? They don't want to talk about the nuances among officers or police as public workers and the contradictions that may be involved there. But I think we have to think in those terms, right? I mean, I think we have to think about what that might mean for the possibilities of producing some real reforms, right? It's sort of the only it's one of the only places with respect to labor in the United States where we can imagine transforming the conditions of a particular workforce by not having them involved at all in that kind of discussion, right? I mean, the idea is that they should be banished, right, for the work that they're doing. But I just think it's not useful. And it actually is the other thing. It actually contradicts how many Americans think about police, right? So you and I could say, having lived in cities, we've seen a lot of shitty behavior. But there are many Americans, even the ones who are out on the streets now, right, who don't have a problem with policing. They have a problem with seeing somebody get, strangled to death on television. And they don't want to see racial disparities. But they actually do want to have policing and more effective policing in their communities. Like you said, the detective who's actually walking around, trying to actually do the work that we imagine a police department should do. So I think that's one of the problems that hasn't been fully addressed by many people who are calling for reform. Like, how do we deal with the fact that so many Americans support police, right? And that actually, their support for police actually strengthened over that first wave of Black Lives Matter protests we saw in Baltimore, or Ferguson, Baltimore, and Chicago back in 2014, 2015. So,
and that's pretty broadly distributed across demographics, right?
Totally.
That's not just a story. When you say that, isn't just like white people like cops.
Yeah, not at all. It's actually Black people. They don't want to be killed by them or abused, but they actually do want, and that's been a story for a long time. They actually want safety in their neighborhoods. Now, the way I would respond in general to that sentiment that many Americans have is that we can have safety. We may be able to achieve that without the kind of policing we have right now, right? We can achieve public safety through more economic security, right? That would be one route. But I think that's a different kind of conversation, that we need to have desperately,
So then you could start to, if you start to build a public social safety net, and then you start to redesign what police are doing and what they're policing, I mean, that could be very mutually beneficial, because you're both saying you're not here to police millions of people that we're just writing off out of the economy, out of society, and we're just giving you the responsibility of checking them and nothing else, because we don't have healthcare, we don't have housing, we don't have provisions. And then that actually could correlate with very worthwhile conversations about why does the police department do so many different things simultaneously. Like, why would somebody who might, investigate the most, serious, like actual crimes, be called in for shoplifting, or that these are really discrete areas in terms of focus.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think like a lot of jobs, it's an impossible job, right? And people are overstretched or stretched thin. Um, I think we can imagine something different. And I think we also have to think about this, that many people go into law enforcement, right? Because they, and we can interrogate this in a lot of different ways, but because they actually have a commitment to want to serve, right? And I think there's a lot of people who do it who should not be officers, who can't handle the stress, and who also have other maybe psychological or other issues that they haven't dealt with, right? And those are manifest on the job. But criminologists have been writing about that stuff for years, right? That different kinds of personalities handle that particular kind of leadership role. Being a sort of street corner bureaucrat or street corner politician, they handle that role in different ways, right? So some people can handle it really well. They're well liked. They know how to deal with community members. Other people not so much, but that's true for all occupations. But I just think we can reimagine it, um, you know, as well as shrink the size of it, but reimagine the kinds of roles that people play in relationship to communities. But ultimately, I think we got to get back to how do we get rid of the class conditions that are the basis of it all, right? How do we eliminate that? Because once that's reduced, I think we wouldn't have the need for the kind of policing that's there, right? We can also imagine um, other ways of dealing with conflicts within communities, and there's been some of this in Minneapolis. I think Jeremiah Ellison made this point recently that they want to take a year to come up with their alternative plan for public safety in Minneapolis, and one of the things that he was enthusiastic about was getting involved in youth gang programs and trying to figure out ways to help young people exit gangs, right? Or, there's other models here in Chicago and other places you've had violence interrupters or former gang members who are involved in trying to help mediate conflicts that pop up in different neighborhoods, right? So I think a lot of that stuff is happening. How effective that could be in terms of scale, I'm skeptical, but I'm also willing to accept that I could be wrong, right? That maybe those are the ways to try to reduce violence in communities without more and excessive and expansive policing.
I think you actually hear behind me some form of these ongoing protests, which I'm not sure if the mic is picking up, but it's great here in New York. But this is the other thing I wanted to touch with you on, because it seems to me that these are like such clear departure points of these conversations, that if we're talking about policing, police violence, racism, how policing is designed, how it relates to poverty and to class, we can go in the direction of the guys, as I said to Torrey Reed on Jacobin the other day, people like Adolph Reed or Torrey Reed or you, who I have I read and have the privilege of talking to. Mm-hmm. Or we can go into kind of another round of sort of, I don't know, middle class metaphysics, or sort of politics, sort of psychological self-improvement masquerading as politics. And I always want to just say, like, I meditate. I think yoga's great, and I don't really have an innate problem with. I'm sure there is value in any different type of methodology to make you a more conscious person, let's just say. So I don't have, I want to be clear that I don't have this sort of like, oh, you're reading a book about, unconscious racial bias or privilege. Like, fuck that. only read a Marxist text, right? But I do think it's very problematic that those kind of like regimes of psychological improvement and social manners substitute for politics,
Right.
and that these really really serious questions that even like in this conversation has gotten us to the sort of those permanently excluded from the labor market, the geography of how we design our cities,
Right.
but how policing relates to how we've decided to do capitalism in the last several decades, deindustrialization after the accomplishments of the Civil Rights Act. I mean, and Voting Rights Act. I mean, these are the big centers of play, not, somebody, not Netflix getting rid of Gone or HBO getting rid of Gone with the Wind. And so, that's not a sign that we're winning, right?
Right.
And so you wrote this great piece that I think, honestly, I've actually tweeted out maybe multiple times in the last couple of weeks, called Wages of Rodiger, Why 3 Decades of Whiteness Studies has Not Produced the Left We Need in Non-Site. And, this is a very big piece. So I'm going to ask you a general, which please take in any direction you want, but can you basically interrogate this idea of this direction of whiteness studies and have a critical intervention so that this moment that, as you said, we need to have a critical awareness of, but also really holds a lot of serious opportunity about looking at about capitalism and food shortages and coercion and abuse instead of public good provision, making sure that doesn't filter into a new sort of regimen of kind of collegiate self-introspection. If that makes sense.
Right. Now that makes sense. So let me start. I'll start with my view of like I guess what you're getting at, navel gazing, middle class metaphysics, as you said. I'll start with that and then maybe work back through Rodiger and maybe come all the way back to Black Lives Matter, because I think there's a way to talk about the Black Lives Matter sentiment that's grounded in neoliberalization as a way to think about it. But I would start by saying I think some of the discussions about implicit bias, right? Some of these are useful within grounded context. And so just as an example, I mean, I've been on multiple search committees, probably too many to even admit to. I've got suckered into doing these things so many times. And, we've, in some instances, I've taken trainings on implicit bias, right? And I've seen it happen in searches, right? I mean, people look through a stack of applications, and what they do is they begin to home in on those applications that look most like their own sense of what an academic should be. And if the room is filled with mostly people who had access to the top 10 schools in their discipline, or who are second and third generation academics, then they will quickly pull out of that stack, right? And it's a way that we sort through these things mentally. If you got to go through 100 applications, you end up pulling out. If you went to Michigan, you're going to pull out a few other Michiganites. If somebody else in that stack is connected to people that right, their application is going to look better, right? And so even if it's not a conscious and overt, like, stereotypical redneck racism, right? There's still those ways that when you get to the short list of candidates that you're going to bring in to interview, that they'll tend to look like the committee, and they'll tend to exclude Black academics whose path into the profession might have been much more circuitous and filled with all sorts of other compromises and other things. And so I've seen it happen, more over and over. And so it's real. And I think it is important to have people trained in that way. The problem is that this stuff has become its own industry, right? It's become its own way of talking about racism in a decontextualized fashion. So it's not just about how I, as a person, evaluate job candidates and what I should do to try to be fair. but it becomes sort of a Wild West scenario where those very ideas, which might have been grounded, whether it's intersectionality, which came out of legal studies, or implicit bias training for job and admissions, job and admissions committees. I think people are just using that stuff and using those terms in ways that do a lot of damage to what they were intended to do within workplaces and universities and other settings. I think with Roediger, I mean, the early stuff that Roediger produced, I found helpful, particularly the ways in which he talks about the evolution of racist and racial language, and the use of certain terms, like how certain terms become epithets, and how they were connected to earlier historical processes. I thought that was fascinating in his book, The Wages of Whiteness. I think also in the more recent book that I reviewed, he also does a great job laying out where the idea of white skin privilege comes from and how it emerges from the New Left. The only issue I take, and what the criticism I try to raise with it, is that I think what he was describing wasn't a universal problem of whites. I think for activists who were trying to navigate a particular context, right? Activists who were in some cases coming out of the labor movement, some others were coming out of civil rights organizing. They'd been part of organizations like SNCC and CORE. For them, they were trying to figure out a way to resolve the dissonance between the high levels of Black mobilization they're seeing, right, during the 1960s, and the relative quiescence of many whites who are now contented and no longer have a material incentive to be engaged in redistributive politics, right? They're not willing to take the same kinds of risk anymore, and they're enjoying a certain level of suburban life, certain suburban middle class lifestyle. And so how do you reconcile that, right? And I think for people like Noel Ignatieff and George Rawick and others, their idea was that this is a function of white skin privilege, right? And I think it's a condensation of what was really middle class skin privilege, right? In a sense, middle class privilege. Not strictly white, because having grown up, in many Black settings, I can say some of the same things that they talk about: the unwillingness to take risk, the antipathy towards redistributive politics, condescension towards working class and poor people. You can find that same sentiment and those same behaviors among other ethnic groups, especially in the 70s and 80s and 90s, right? So I think it's not, what they're describing is not strictly a white problem, but rather it's a middle class problem that they've described in racial terms, right? The other thing I would probably add to that, as far as Roediger's work goes, it lends itself to this idea that white people are animated and they move according to identity or commitment to a particular kind of conservative politics, an anti-urbanism, right? And there's some of that, but there are also whites who fought to stay in cities. And I think that story is lost. I was having a back and forth with a friend of mine about this recently. During the 1960s, you got people like Marshall Berman, who's a Bronx native, who witnesses, the butchering of the Bronx to make way for the Cross Bronx Expressway. You've got Jane Jacobs, who's also fighting against Bob Moses. You've got other people like here in Chicago, Florence Scala, who fought to defend the Italian and Greek neighborhoods on the near West Side. When my university was being built on top of them, if you walk outside, this is a quick sidebar, walk outside my building. If you look along the main sidewalk, right on Harrison Street, if you ever come to Chicago, I'll show you, you can still see the basement foundations of the houses that would hit. Like there's a dip in the grass, right? That goes quite a routine.
That's insane.
Intervals. Yeah, you can see the remnants of the basement foundations where mostly Italian, Americans lived. And so these people wanted to stay in the city, right? They wanted to remain in cities. It's not to say they didn't have their own biases against people in other neighborhoods, but they were committed to staying in place, right? They actually had a different view of what could have happened in America, right? Not suburbanization and sprawl, but rather neighborhoods that were predicated on, street life and small scale commerce and small workshops and other things. So I think there are people, we kind of get lost in this broad narratives about white flight and Black ghettoization, but there are people on both sides of like the color line who didn't go along with the broad, trajectory that Roediger and others tend to abide. The other thing is, I'm not really sure, and maybe this is the part goes back to the problems of the George Floyd protests. I think a lot of this is going to veer in the direction of exactly what you're describing, right? Books. I just found out a book store here in my area where I live. Books are flying off the shelves that deal with race and whiteness and what have you. And I can see people forming study groups. It's not to say no good is going to come of that, right? I mean, I think any kind of intellectual engagement can have some value, some merits. But what does it mean to do that stuff and not necessarily engage in the redistribution, right? It's quite possible that people could read some books, start a study group, have some sort of, therapeutic conversations about race, and ultimately not change the deeper inequalities that exist in the country, right? The fact that you can, if you, depending on who your parents are, where you're born, you can get a high quality education, or you can get a shit education that'll, condemn you to this kind of school to prison pipeline, as folks like to describe it. So I think
I acknowledge my privilege. And I can keep my money, right?
Right.
That's the line now.
You get to keep at the same time.
Yeah, I was just like, I absolutely acknowledge and keep.
Right.
So that's interesting, because then that actually explicitly, and Vivek Chibber made this point on the show recently, where he's like, that is class politics, right? When you have a bunch of primarily, let's say managerial class, upper middle class people turning, not saying like, okay, we need to understand race and racism. We also need to understand just, as an example, even that's the access to the suburbs and how it, and there were obviously discriminatory policies in terms of housing, but then that also how that demobilized labor. If it just becomes a sort of that specific conversation about how you relate as an individual to quote unquote doing the right thing,
right,
that carries a class politics to it, because you're actually, and you hear this sometimes now too, when the argument about class reductionism is actually the idea that you can't even get to these universal provisions without this sort of moral change. And the last thing I want to just throw in, I think you'll like it anecdotally, but I have a friend of mine who's Black, who grew up in a very, very rural, highly white area, working class white New England area. And absolutely, she said, tons of racism, without question.
Right.
And she also said, though, that the whole conversation, though, about like, she said, of course everybody supports Trump, because the police chief likes Trump, the minister likes Trump, and the one guy that provides a job at a quarry in the town is a local Republican bigwig. So even in that context, which would just get written off as like, metaphysical whiteness or the sins of whiteness or people voting against their own interest, again, it's not negating that there's all sorts of disgusting attitudes and ridiculous beliefs, but even there, you can actually very quickly materialize even that, like, yeah, I go to a Trump rally because that's where I might get some summer work. Or if I get pulled over, in fact, for drunken driving, might help if the chief knows that I'm, a MAGA guy in good standing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's all sorts of reasons why people supported him. And I remember saying this to folks at the time. I actually didn't think he was going to get elected, but I thought he had an appeal, in certain corners, um, not just simply because of the anti-immigrant posturing, but because he wasn't a beltway guy, right? He wasn't a
Right.
guy who came off like he had looked at a ton of focus group, reports, and he's not watching the polls all the time. He says exactly what he thinks. And I think that was endearing to some people, right? They actually believed that this guy was like honest, and he was really a person who was going to try to reverse the damage of NAFTA and other international trade agreements that had gutted places of jobs. So I think that rhetoric was resonant. His comedic delivery too. I mean, the guy's,
Hilarious.
I always find myself laughing at him, even in his most vile moments, right? He has like a certain, almost like stand-up comedian's delivery, and I think that also appeals to people in the age that we're in, right? Um, I was gonna circle back, man. One thing about the Black Lives Matter, dimension that might connect back to whiteness, right? In a way, I think a lot of the anxiety that many working class and even PMC Black people have has to do with the ways in which whatever gains were made during the 1960s have been weakened and reversed in different ways. And so I think that's really what people are feeling, right? That the horizon that seemed to be there, and I can kind of remember the very tail end of it in the 80s, right? You still had 70s is optimistic, right? People are like this, Black mayors being elected, Blacks are creating businesses. There's all sorts of integration in popular culture. Um, there's still some optimism coming out of that period. Reagan Bush era, pretty much puts an end to that. And I think the reversals in real terms, whether it's the weakening of affirmative action policies, and both at the state level, but also within the context of universities and other institutions. I think the gutting of public housing, demolition of public housing across the country, and the kinds of affordable housing crisis that produced, the you know the privatization of schools, right, and the kind of tumult that many parents were thrown into with charterization and school choice and all these other things that are happening. And so I think a lot of that, right? People have been impacted by it. The racial argument resonates in some ways, right? Because one, it's mostly white Republicans at first who are calling for gutting social services and undermining anti-racist policies. So I think it feels like a racial drama, and in many ways it is. But the impact is very much a class impact, right? I mean, working class people are suffering disproportionately. One route that Black people did have towards the middle class in the way of public sector employment has been under siege, for a few decades now. And so I think with all of those doors being closed, the return to a strong anti-racism makes sense to a lot of people. But as I've said, I just think it's inadequate as a way of, you have to address like the actual policies that have been implemented and the ways that they've affected people's lives in really specific contexts.
Yeah, and I'll just reaffirm, I guess, and maybe this, if you have final thoughts to just tie this all together, this has just been great, but it isn't, the argument that you're putting forward is not, this isn't it's not it's certainly not an all lives matter argument. It's
Right.
not even a moralistic appeal to, we all need to come together. Like, we do all need to come together, actually, in a certain sense, but practically, because that's the only countervailing force that you could possibly have to capital, right? So that, but that anchoring these arguments materially is not getting away from the urgency of anything. It's bypassing some of the morality plays to get to where the weak points in the system are to actually change something along all these lines. Is that, I mean, that's how I read all of this.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely it. I mean, I think, you know, this is the one, there's certain moments when I'm glad I was a poli-sci, you know, major in undergrad and grad school, because, you know, politics is a complex and unrelenting process, right? And I think we can't, you know, there's importance of slogans. I'm not against, you know, the power of good slogans and the ways they can bring people out into the streets. But ultimately, right, I mean, it's protracted struggle, right, that's going to deliver the kinds of things that we want. And I think, you know, I think that for some people, the George Floyd protests will be like an opening, right? It'll be the beginning of their political journey, right? They'll start out with George Floyd protests. They went with their parents, and then ultimately, right, they'll maybe end up somewhere else. That doesn't stop you and I from trying to continuously push people to think about what's at stake here, like what's really at stake. What do ruling elites in this country want, right? Because that's the other thing. Like right now, we're hearing what, you know, some Black Lives Matter activists want because they're on Twitter and everywhere else saying it. But you know, we know that there's like the Chamber of Commerce, you know, business alliance types in every city who are sitting down with mayors. They're not going to talk about it. They're not going to have a press conference, but they're sitting down like, how are you going to guarantee us that the downtown tourist zone remains viable, that we'll be able to have, you know, visitors, the real estate, you know, sectors they're worrying about. How can we make sure that more middle class and wealthy residents continue to move into our cities? And for them, policing is a fundamental dimension of that, right? They're not talking about dissolve the police. They want to get away with a public relations morass. They don't want to deal with that sort of trash, but they're definitely still thinking in terms of how do we help the system to perpetuate itself. And I think we have to be aware of that, right? I mean, I think that was part of the reason for writing a piece about, you know, the response of the congressional Democrats and, you know, all of these major corporations, right? Because they're totally on board with a version of anti-racism that will, again, allow them to continue along this path of perpetual compound growth and profit making, right? I mean, that's totally what they're on board with. And I think we have to be equally serious, right? I mean, about not only analyzing and understanding what they're up to, but also fighting against some of the posturing, some of the utopianism, and some of the lack of practical thinking about politics in our own midst. I think that's critically important right now.
So you're saying that if Andrew Cuomo dressed like Jaffe Joffer, that wouldn't be a win?
Hey man, I wouldn't be surprised if he did. After
yeah, we're right there. He's gonna have the lion.
Surprise, man.
Cedric Johnson, I really, really, really appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, man.
Absolutely. You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.